Welcome to the deep dive. You know how sometimes history can feel, well, a bit dry, just dates and names.
Yeah, like a textbook.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, today, we're digging into something recent that feels much more like a thriller, honestly. It's the 12-day Israel-Iran war that happened back in June 2025.
Oh, absolutely. It was definitely one of the stranger conflicts we've seen lately. I mean, think about it. When it was all over, you had not one, not two, but all three main leaders declaring victory.
Right. How does that even happen? And our sources, they even mention former U.S. President Donald Trump saying he deserved a Nobel Prize for his part. Apparently 6 times he said that.
Yeah, classic Trump. But look, that's why this is so interesting to unpack.
That's our mission today, really, to get past the headlines and figure out what actually went down during those 12 intense days. Why did this war just suddenly kick off, especially given, Iran hadn't actually done anything right beforehand to provoke it?
And just as importantly, why did it end so abruptly? Everyone was sort of bracing for a much longer fight.
And maybe the biggest question, what was really driving these leaders? You mentioned Trump, but then there's Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. I mean, the backdrop of his corruption trials, the allegations he was extending other wars to avoid jail.
And that famous "I don't remember" line he apparently used over 10,000 times in court. It's quite the context.
It really is.
Mhm.
So we're going to look at the triggers, the rapid escalation, and those, well, surprising background deals that brought it all to such a sudden stop.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. June 13th, 2025, early morning hours.
Yeah, over 200 Israeli fighter jets. They just fly straight into Iranian airspace. Israel called it Operation Rising Lion.
And their targets were very specific. We're talking over 100 sites, nuclear facilities, military bases, key infrastructure.
Yeah.
Pretty widespread.
The initial hit was, well, pretty devastating. Reports said around 80 people killed, over 300 injured. And tragically, most of them were unarmed civilians.
And beyond the infrastructure damage, there were these really high-profile assassinations. Iran's armed forces chief, Mohammad Bagheri, the head of the IRGC, Hossein Salami.
And several nuclear scientists, too, right? Like Mohammad Mahdi Tharanji and Faridun Abbasi.
Exactly. So a very targeted, very impactful first strike.
And Israel's reason, what they say officially?
Their stated justification was self-defense. They claimed Iran posed an imminent nuclear weapon threat.
But, and this seems crucial, our sources really stress there was no immediate provocation from Iran's side just before the attack. So what was this imminent threat actually based on?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It seems to have hinged on a leaked confidential report from the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. This was dated May 31st, 2025.
Okay, and what did that report say?
It indicated Iran had stockpiled around 400 kilograms of uranium, enriched to 60%. Now, the really critical bit is the wording. The report said this material could be used to make maybe up to 10 nuclear weapons.
Could be used. Not that they had them ready to go.
Precisely, a very important distinction. The report didn't say Iran had functioning bombs, just the potential material. But that seemed to be enough justification for Israel's preemptive strike.
And predictably, things escalated almost instantly. That same night, June 13th, Iran fired back. Dozens of missiles, drones, heading towards Israel.
Right. Israel's defenses intercepted most of them, but not all. Some definitely got through, hitting targets in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, causing, real damage.
So began the tit for tat. The next few days saw more attacks flying back and forth, more destruction, more civilian casualties on both sides.
And that's when Donald Trump really jumps into the picture. He immediately starts demanding Iran's unconditional surrender, starts issuing these very public threats against Ayatollah Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader.
Who, in turn, was pretty defiant, vowing they wouldn't surrender.
Absolutely not. So Trump ups the ante. By June 19th, he lays down this ultimatum. Iran gets 2 weeks to agree to a new nuclear deal on his terms, presumably, or the U.S. military gets directly involved.
And he wasn't bluffing. Just 2 days later, June 21st, the U.S. makes its move. About 125 American planes enter Iranian airspace.
And their targets were those core nuclear facilities, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. Now, these weren't easy targets.
No, they're built deep underground, right?
Yeah.
Some inside mountains, hundreds of meters down.
Exactly. Your standard bombs wouldn't even touch them. Which is why the U.S. brought out the big gun.
The GBU-57s, the bunker buster.
That's the one. The Massive Ordnance Penetrator. It's a beast of a bomb, weighs over 13,000 kilograms. It's more than 6 meters long, and it's designed specifically to penetrate over 60 meters of earth or rock before exploding.
Wow. And this is the first time they'd actually used this specific bomb in a real conflict.
First time ever. They flew B-2 stealth bombers all the way from Missouri, a 37-hour nonstop flight to drop them. And for the Isfahan site, which was apparently even deeper, they also used a Tomahawk cruise missile launched from a submarine.
So a major show of force.
Absolutely. And right after these strikes, Trump goes public, declaring it a complete military success. He claimed Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities were, quote, completely and totally destroyed.
Okay, so at this point, U.S. bombs have hit Iran's deepest nuclear sites. Everyone must be thinking, okay, here we go, this is going to drag on.
You'd think so. But then, another twist. On June 23rd, Iran responds. They fire 19 missiles, but not at Israel this time. They target the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar.
Which is the biggest U.S. military base in the whole Middle East.
Right, but here's the fascinating part. Only one of those 19 missiles actually hit the base, and it caused minimal damage.
1 out of 19. That seems intentional.
Well, it gets even more interesting. It turns out Iran had actually given Qatar and the U.S. an advance warning before they launched the missiles.
They warned them, so the U.S. had time to move their planes.
Exactly. Most of the aircraft were moved safely out of the way, so why do that? The thinking among geopolitical experts is that Iran didn't actually want a full-blown war with the U.S. They needed to show their own people they'd hit back, but they did it in a way that minimized actual damage and casualties. A symbolic retaliation, essentially.
Still, it had immediate effects, right? Closing airspace?
Oh, yeah. Commercial flights over Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE all shut down for about 8 to 10 hours. So regional jitters were definitely high.
And then just like that, the very next day, June 24th.
Boom. Donald Trump announces a complete and total ceasefire. Just completely out of the blue for most observers.
And this is where we get that bizarre situation of everyone claiming they won.
Right. You have Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran saying their nuclear sites suffered minimal damage, warning against future attacks. You have Trump presenting himself as the hero who stopped World War III.
And mentioning the Nobel Prize again, of course.
Naturally. And he even threw in that he stopped a war between Pakistan and India, which is interesting.
And Netanyahu and Israel.
Also declared victory. Mission accomplished, nuclear sites destroyed, struck a blow against the existential enemy, you know, the standard rhetoric. And he had some public backing. That Israeli Democracy Institute poll showed 70% support for hitting Iran.
But let's bring in that domestic context for Netanyahu again, because it seems really relevant here.
It really does. So remember, he's juggling these 3 corruption trials. They already been delayed multiple times because of the fighting in Gaza and Lebanon.
And just 10 days before this Iran attack kicked off, his cross-examination had started. June 3rd. That's when the, I don't remember count, hit that staggering 10,778 number.
It's unbelievable. And public opinion wasn't great for him on the other conflicts either. Israeli Channel 12 news polls showed 55% thought he was dragging out the Gaza war just to stay in power. Over 60% wanted the Gaza war to end if the hostages were released.
There was even that opinion piece in the Times of Israel around then, wasn't there? Something like Netanyahu's calculation, the war must go on.
Precisely. And add to that, a bill passed back in December 2024 giving Israeli parliament members, including him, almost total criminal immunity while they're in office.
So the incentive to stay in power and potentially keep conflicts going to delay things was huge.
And it wasn't just speculation. You had former IDF General Israel Ziv openly accusing Netanyahu of prolonging the Gaza war specifically to avoid jail time.
Which devil makes you ask?
Yeah.
Was launching this attack on Iran, this new crisis, also part of that calculation? Another way to delay the trials? Rally support.
The timing is certainly suggestive. And then just 2 days after the ceasefire, June 26th, Trump publicly calls for Netanyahu's trials to be dismissed, calling them a witch hunt. And Netanyahu thanks him publicly. It paints a picture.
So how did the ceasefire actually happen behind the scenes?
Well, the sources suggest Trump spoke with Netanyahu first, got him on board. Then Qatar played the role of intermediary. They relayed messages back and forth to Iran, telling the U.S. they wouldn't hit any more U.S. bases, and the U.S. agreeing not to hit Iran again.
But even after the ceasefire was announced, there were still a few parting shots.
Yeah, this is another weird detail. In the hours right after the ceasefire announcement, both sides took one last shot. It seems like it was purely for their domestic audiences, you know, to show they got the last word.
What happened?
Iran launched 2 more ballistic missiles towards Israel. And then Israel responded by taking out a radar station near Tehran. Apparently, Trump wasn't thrilled about it, but he and Netanyahu came to an understanding, just posturing, essentially.
Okay, so a rapid start, a sudden end, Everyone claims victory, lots of potential political maneuvering. But what about the actual goal? What really happened to Iran's nuclear program? Was it completely and totally destroyed, like Trump said?
Well, that's where the official story and the intelligence assessments really diverged. Trump claimed everything burned black, total destruction.
But the Pentagon's intelligence people, the DIA,
The Defense Intelligence Agency had a very different take. Their assessment was that the strikes mostly damaged the above-ground buildings at those sites. The really important stuff, the centrifuges deep underground, the stockpiled, highly enriched uranium, they concluded that wasn't destroyed.
wait, the uranium wasn't destroyed?
Even more surprisingly, an early U.S. intel assessment apparently indicated that the Iranians might have actually moved the enriched uranium out of those sites before the attacks even happened.
Seriously? So the main target material might not have even been there?
It's possible. So the DIA's bottom line was that the whole 12-day war probably only delayed Iran's nuclear program by, quote, a few months. Not exactly the total destruction Trump claimed.
Which leads to a huge question. If Iran was trying to get a bomb, does an attack like this stop them or just make them more determined?
That's the debate, isn't it? From Iran's point of view, maybe they think, look, we got attacked when we only might have been building a weapon. If we actually had nuclear weapons like North Korea, maybe nobody would dare touch us.
So it could backfire, deterrence-wise.
The Arms Control Association in Washington certainly thinks so. They argue military strikes often just strengthen a country's resolve to get the bomb for future protection. Of course, Iran's official line is still that their program is purely peaceful for civilian energy. They point to Ayatollah Khamenei's fatwa from 2003 against nuclear weapons, which is still technically in place.
But the intelligence picture around Iran's intentions was all over the place leading up to this, wasn't it?
Completely contradictory. You had the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, testifying to Congress in March 2025 that Iran was not actively building nuclear weapons.
But then, right after Israel attacked,
the DNI's office did a complete 180. Suddenly they were saying Iran was building a weapon and could have one within weeks. A huge shift, right when it was needed to justify the actions, perhaps.
and the IAEA chief, Grossi,
Rafael Grossi also pushed back against the imminent threat idea around that time. He said the IAEA hadn't found any evidence of an active systematic plan to build a nuclear weapon.
and you mentioned earlier the IAEA report that Israel used as justification.
Contained no new information, nothing the international community didn't basically already know about Iran's enrichment levels.
You know, when you lay it all out, it sounds uncomfortably familiar.
The Iraq War comparisons are almost unavoidable, aren't they? An invasion justified by claims of WMDs that weren't there. Here, an attack justified by an imminent nuclear threat based on, well, ambiguous evidence and known facts.
And the irony is, there was potentially a way to avoid all this, or at least avoid the justification for it.
Our sources call it the simple solution,
Oh,
diplomacy, specifically a nuclear deal.
Like the one they had, the JCPOA from 2015.
Exactly. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, negotiated under Obama, it worked pretty well. Iran capped its enrichment at a very low level, 3.67%, and allowed extensive IAEA inspections.
And in return, sanctions were lifted. They could trade normally.
Right. And by all accounts, Iran was sticking to the deal up until 2018.
Enter Donald Trump.
He unilaterally pulls the U.S. out of the deal in 2018. Didn't really give a clear reason other than maybe, as some sources suggest, wanting to just shred the Obama legacy.
And the consequences.
Predictable. Sanctions snapped back on Iran, the IAEA lost a lot of its inspection access, and crucially, Iran restarted its high-level enrichment program, eventually reaching that 60% level.
Which then became the very excuse used for this 12-day war in 2025.
The irony is just staggering. Trump's own actions arguably created the conditions for the crisis he later claimed credit for ending.
But that simple solution, a diplomatic deal, it's still possible, right?
Technically, yes. The U.S. or the international community could pursue a new nuclear agreement with Iran, probably along similar lines to the JCPOA. That path is still open.
So if Trump were to be in office again, would he take that path? It seems counterintuitive to his past actions, but...
Well, it's an interesting political calculation for him, isn't it? A deal might actually appeal to his base now. You even had people like Tucker Carlson, usually a big supporter, questioning why U.S. bombers were getting involved in another Middle East conflict, given Trump's whole America First anti-war rhetoric during his campaigns. So a diplomatic win might actually be politically useful for him. It's hard to predict.
So wrapping this all up, what's the big takeaway for you listening to this? This 12-day Israel-Iran war in June 2025, it really does stand out. It feels less like a straightforward geopolitical clash and more like something else.
It really does. It seems like a conflict where the personal political needs of the leaders involved, needing a win, needing a distraction, wanting to look like a hero, might have played just as big a role, maybe even bigger, than any objective assessment of an existential threat.
And you see that in the outcome, right? All three leaders, Khamenei, Trump, Netanyahu, declare victory. But their victories were defined entirely by their own domestic political contexts, not by any clear result on the battlefield or change in the nuclear situation.
Exactly. The way it started so fast ended even faster. It suggests this really complex game of brinkmanship, of signaling, maybe even some kind of prearranged drama, honestly, but with very real consequences and risks for the region and the world.
It really peels back a layer on international relations, doesn't it? Makes you think about how much these huge, world-impacting decisions can be driven by very personal, very human motivations of the leaders at the top.
Absolutely. The need for political survival can be an incredibly powerful force.
So here's something to leave you with, something to mull over. In this age of instant information, where wars can seemingly ignite and extinguish with bewildering speed, does chasing a nuclear deterrent actually buy security? Or does it just raise the stakes in these high-level political games? And what does it do to global trust, to the chances for real peace, when we see national actions potentially driven so much by the personal political fortunes of individual leaders? Definitely something to think about.